Some stories never make the news. They happen inside, in the silence after a betrayal, in the patience of someone told to just accept it, in the moment they decided they were done accepting. This is a channel for those people, for every story that was fought and won somewhere no one else could see. Welcome to Family Ties and Lies. There was a folder on the coffee table with a pen beside it at a precise angle, and my son was asking me to sign away the garden my husband and I had built over 40 years. On the counter behind him, catching the late morning light, sat a champagne flute, half finished. Someone had been celebrating before I got home from the hospital. I was 67 years old. I had finished my last chemotherapy treatment that morning, and my daughter-in-law was smiling at me with an expression of such warm concern that anyone watching would have believed she loved me. Let me go back to the beginning of that morning, because the order matters. The flowers Nathan brought to the hospital were sunflowers. He held them out in the lobby with a smile he had clearly worked on in the car. And I took them the way you take things from someone you love who has stopped being careful with you. Warmly, without letting on that you noticed. 6 weeks of chemotherapy, of losing my hair the way Gerald had left me, quietly and without making a fuss, of learning to walk the corridor without my hand on the wall. I was thin in a way I had not been since my 20s, tired in a way sleep does not fix. When Nathan helped me into the passenger seat and the door closed, I told myself I was going home. I did not yet know what I was going home to. Nathan was quiet on the drive. He asked how I felt. I told him tired but grateful. At Morrison Street, 3 blocks from Whitfield Gardens, the light turned red and the car stopped. I looked out the passenger window. The sold sign was there, white letters on red, staked at the property entrance. But that was not what took my breath. What took my breath were the orange survey stakes, thin plastic rods driven into the ground every few feet along the length of the lavender row Gerald had planted the spring after Lily was born. Someone had walked through my garden with a clipboard and decided, in my absence, where the walls of something new would go. The light changed. Nathan drove forward without a word. I did not speak. I folded my hands in my lap and breathed the way the nurses had shown me, slowly and without force. Nathan did not look at me. He had driven this route deliberately, I understood, so that I would see it before we arrived, so that it would already be a fact by the time we sat down. Amber met us at the door in a cream blouse, her hair freshly done, her smile in place before we reached the porch steps. She said I looked wonderful, said they were relieved I was finally home. She stepped aside and I walked into the house, past the white roses and the champagne flute I have already described. I had been right about what I would find. I had simply not let myself believe it until I stood inside it. Nathan set my overnight bag by the stairs. "Mom, come sit down. There are some things we need to go over." The folder waited on the cleared coffee table, the papers squared, the pen at its precise angle. I walked toward the chair across from the sofa. 3 steps in, my right leg went unreliable under me, the way it had since the 3rd week of treatment, and I put my hand on the back of the chair before I sat. Just a moment. Nathan saw it and turned to the window. Amber watched me with an expression I could not immediately name. I sat. Amber sat beside Nathan, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at me with patience. Nathan pushed the folder across the table. "While you were in treatment," he said carefully, "Amber and I had to make some decisions about the property, about your future." He looked at his hands. "We found a buyer for Whitfield Gardens. The sale closed 2 weeks ago. $980,000, more than market value. Mom, we wanted resources in place for whatever your recovery needs." The room was quiet. Outside, a neighbor was running a mower down the block. I looked at the folder, then at Nathan. He was studying the edge of the coffee table. Then I looked at Amber. She leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying a concern so carefully constructed I could not find where it had been built. She said, "Mom, I want you to see the full picture before you decide. If the acknowledgement form goes unresolved, the estate enters a legal review period. No access to the joint accounts Gerald left. No movement on any shared assets while the courts work through it. That can take months." She let that land. "You just finished treatment. I cannot imagine your doctor would call that kind of stress good for your recovery." I heard what she said. I also heard what she did not say, which was that she knew the accounts Gerald had left, knew the structure of what we had built, and understood exactly how much I stood to lose if I did not cooperate. I looked at my own hands in my lap. They were steadier than I expected. "I think I need to lie down," I said. "I am still very tired from the drive." Nathan started to say something. I was already standing, one hand on the chair arm, moving the way I had to move now, carefully and without rushing. "Of course," Amber said. "Take all the time you need." I walked down the hallway to the guest room and closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall across from me, a color I had not chosen. The folder was still on the coffee table, the pen still beside it. In that room, in the quiet of a house where nothing belonged to me, I sat with what I knew and what I did not yet have, and what I was going to have to become. For one long moment, I could not have told you which way it would go. The guest room at Nathan's house was beige, not the warm beige of things that have aged honestly, but the flat beige of a room designed to suit everyone and belong to no one. Amber had chosen everything in it: the abstract print above the headboard, the throw at the foot of the bed, the diffuser releasing a scent suited to nothing in particular. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my overnight bag. 6 weeks in that hospital, and I had learned to pack for exactly what I needed: clothes, medication, and Gerald's photograph. The one from our 30th anniversary, the two of us in the garden in August, squinting into the sun because we had asked a stranger to take it, and he had aimed us directly at the light. We looked ridiculous. We looked happy. I turned to set it on the nightstand and stopped. The nightstand held a small lamp, a decorative tray with a single succulent positioned at its center, and a folded note card with Amber's handwriting. "Made sure the room is fresh for you, Mom. Let me know if you need anything." Everything had been placed with care. There was no space for a photograph, not because the surface was too small, because it had been arranged so that there would not be. I opened the drawer and put Gerald inside. Then I turned off the lamp and lay down in the dark. The ceiling was also beige. I thought about the garden. It did not begin as a plan. It began with Gerald coming home one spring Saturday with the trunk of the car full of bare root roses from a nursery that was going out of business. He had not asked me. He unloaded them onto the backyard grass and stood looking at the mud, and then looked at me with the expression he had, half apology and entirely certain of itself. And I said yes before he asked. We planted them in the rain. My knees were soaked through, and Gerald kept losing the plant markers in the wet ground. And at one point he stood straight up and said, "I genuinely cannot understand why people romanticize this." I laughed until I sat down in the mud. He watched me a moment, and then he sat down beside me. And we stayed there in the April rain, looking at what we had done, which was mostly holes and good intentions. That was the beginning of Whitfield Gardens. The garden grew the way most lasting things grow, not by design, but by accumulation. The lavender row came the spring after Lily was born. The white peonies went in the year I finished teaching, because Gerald looked at me across the kitchen table one evening and said, "You spent 32 years growing other people's children. You deserve something that blooms extravagantly and without any practical purpose." I wrote it in the back of my journal that night, and I still know exactly which page. There was one Tuesday afternoon, years before any of this, when Gerald put on his good shirt and drove downtown and would not say what for. He came home a few hours later, hung the shirt back up, and went out to check the irrigation lines as if nothing had happened. I assumed it was a permit. He was always dealing with some permit or other. I did not ask, and I forgot about it for a very long time. There was a year, the year Nathan was 15 and money was genuinely difficult, when Gerald wanted to sell the back half of the property. The mortgage was heavy and the numbers were not cooperating, and Gerald was a practical man who did not carry debt easily. He laid it out one evening after dinner, clear and without drama, and I said no. We did not speak properly for 3 days. Not fighting, just parallel, which is its own loneliness inside a house. On the 4th morning, Gerald got up before dawn. I watched him from the kitchen window. He walked the rows the way he always did, slowly, hands at his sides. He stood in the lavender for a long time. When he came inside, he poured his coffee, sat across from me, and said he had called the bank to restructure the payment schedule instead. He did not apologize for suggesting it. I did not apologize for refusing. That was the end of it. I have thought about that morning many times. The way he stood in the lavender without performing anything, looking at what we had built, until he arrived at a different answer than the one he walked out with. Gerald died on a Thursday morning in October. He had walked the rows the day before, checking on things the way he did each autumn, and come inside to tell me the south fence post was leaning again before washing his hands at the sink. 3 days later, I sat in a room I had never been in before, making decisions I had not prepared for. The night before we buried him, I went out and sat in the garden in the dark for a long time, in the lavender row at the end of its season, in the place where his hands had been for 40 years. That felt close enough to prayer. He had told me something once, years before the end, one of those ordinary evenings that turn out to be the ones that stay. He said, "Ruth, this garden is your name. Do not let anyone plant something else where your name used to be." I had nodded. I had not stopped to mark it the way I should have. Lying in that beige room in the dark, with Gerald in a drawer because there was no place left for him on the surface of things, I thought about that sentence and understood it differently than I had before. Gerald had been gone 3 years when they drove their stakes into his lavender. But I had learned something from 41 years with that man that Amber had never once thought to account for. Gerald did not just plant and walk away. He planned for what came after. He always planned ahead. Amber did not dismantle my relationship with my son overnight. She was far too patient for that. A woman who moves quickly leaves evidence. What Amber understood from the very first Sunday dinner she sat at my table was that the cleanest kind of theft is the kind that looks, at every step, like something else entirely. The first year, she brought me a book about estate planning, gift-wrapped, ribbon and all, set on my kitchen table with a warm explanation about how women living alone should have a clear plan for their assets. She said it with genuine concern in her voice. That evening, after she and Nathan left, Gerald picked up the book and turned it over in his hands, the way he handled things he did not trust, and set it back down without a word. We looked at each other across the table. We did not need to say anything. Gerald poured more coffee, and we sat with what we both now understood. She called me Mom from that first month, and she remembered things precisely. What I took in my coffee, the month Gerald's birthday fell, a comment I had made once about wanting to see the Oregon coast. She filed these things and used them well. For a long while, that felt like warmth. I mistook a good memory for a good heart. Those are not the same thing. By the fourth year, Nathan called less. Not dramatically, just less. When I brought it up with him gently, he said something I recognized immediately as not his own. He said, "Mom, you have to understand that Amber works very hard, and the weekends are really the only time she has to decompress." He delivered it with the patient tone of a man who has rehearsed a line until he has nearly forgotten he did not write it. By the sixth year, Lily's Saturday visits had been reorganized. Amber explained at once with perfect gentleness that Lily had so much on her plate, and they did not want to overwhelm her with too many commitments. She said commitments, as if my kitchen table were something Lily required protection from. I started keeping a small notebook around that time, not because I had a plan, the way you start paying closer attention to a sound in the walls before you know what it is. Now I want to tell you about my 65th birthday, because it is the clearest picture I have of what 9 years of patience looks like when you finally see it directly. Nathan had promised to come. Lily had promised to come. I cooked the things Nathan had liked since childhood, and Lily arrived early with a store-bought cake, and we ate a slice together before she had to leave for an evening class. An hour later, Nathan called. He said Amber was not feeling well and they were going to have to miss tonight, and he was sorry. He really was. I told him not to worry about it. That night, around 9 o'clock, Lily called me. She said, "Grandma," and then she went quiet in a way I recognized. She had seen something. I did not ask what. I said, "Baby," she was probably feeling better by evening, "these things come and go." Lily went quiet again. Then she told me about her week, and I listened carefully. And when we hung up, I sat in my kitchen with the leftover food covered in plastic wrap and the half-eaten birthday cake on the counter, and I did not cry. I was 65 years old, and I had cried enough times in my life to know when it would not help. I looked up Amber's account myself. The photograph was from a restaurant that had opened that spring in the Pearl District. Nathan was smiling. Amber was smiling. The caption said something about spontaneous evenings. and being grateful. I closed the phone and put it face down. 8 months later, I was diagnosed. The night after I got the results, before I had called anyone, before I had made any plan, I went out and sat in the garden in the dark. I sat in the lavender row in the middle of September with my coat on, and I was, for the first time in a very long while, genuinely afraid. Not afraid of dying. I had made a kind of peace with dying in the abstract, the way most people do by 65 if they have been paying attention. What I was afraid of was not having enough time. That if I did not get through the treatment, Amber would move through everything we had built without anyone left to stop her. That Lily would grow up without a place to remember me by. That Gerald's garden would become something with walls and ventilation systems and a name neither of us had ever said. I sat there in the dark and I cried. I want to be honest about that. Not the quiet kind, the kind that originates somewhere below the chest and takes a long time to finish and leaves you emptied out in a way that is not entirely unpleasant. I cried for the garden and for Gerald and for Nathan, who I was losing in a different way, and for Lily, who deserved better than what this family was becoming. Then I went inside and I washed my face and I went to bed. The next morning, early, I called Hal Greer. I had spent 9 years watching Amber work. I knew what she wanted and how she moved toward it. What she had never once stopped to consider was that I had been learning her right back and that I had just been given the clearest possible reason to put everything I had learned to use. The night I understood the full shape of what she intended. She did not know I was in the house. Lying in that guest room the first night, with Nathan's folder still unsigned on the coffee table, and Amber's voice still moving through my thoughts, I kept returning to a Thursday evening 2 years earlier. Gerald used to say that God's timing and our timing are rarely the same thing, and that the confusion between the two is where most of the interesting parts of a life happen. I had not understood that fully until the night I picked up the wrong telephone at exactly the right moment. 2 years before they sold my garden, I was upstairs in the Craftsman house looking for the number I had written down for Lily's new apartment. I picked up the bedroom extension and the line was already live. Nathan had called the downstairs phone. Amber had answered. The old wiring in the house sometimes connected both extensions without warning, and I had meant to have it looked at for years. That evening, I was very glad I had not. I did not announce myself. I held the handset against my ear and I listened. Amber was speaking in the voice she used when she had already made a decision and was in the process of bringing Nathan along to it. I had heard that voice at enough dinner tables to know its particular quality. She said the garden was sitting there doing nothing useful for me, that it was worth over $1 million in the current market, and that the thoughtful thing, the caring thing, would be to help me access that value while I was still well enough to enjoy it. She said I would thank them eventually. There was a silence on Nathan's end that lasted longer than it should have. Then he said, she would never agree to sell it. Amber's voice did not change. She said, she would not have to be the one who decides. I stood in the upstairs hallway of my own house and heard my daughter-in-law explain to my son how to take something from me without my permission, in a tone so measured and reasonable that if you had walked into that hallway and heard only those words, You might have mistaken the whole thing for an act of kindness. I set the handset back into the cradle very carefully. Then I sat down on the edge of the bed in the dark, and I stayed there for a long time. I want to be accurate about what happened in me that night, because it matters. I did not immediately become the woman with a plan. What I became for several hours was uncertain. I turned the conversation over from every angle I could reach. Perhaps I had caught it in the middle. Perhaps there had been context I was missing. Perhaps Nathan had said more after I hung up, had pushed back in ways I had not heard. I gave those possibilities a genuine hearing because Nathan was my son, and I believed I owed him that before I acted on what I thought I understood. By 4 a.m, sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and the stillness of a house that had been empty since Gerald died, I had run out of ways to hear it differently. I knew Amber's voice in all its registers. I knew the difference between the voice she used when she was still deciding something and the voice she used when the deciding was already done. What I had heard on that telephone was the second voice. She had thought about this before that Thursday evening. She had thought about it carefully and from several directions. And she had arrived at my son's kitchen with a plan already in hand. I made coffee in the dark kitchen and sat at the table where Gerald and I had eaten most of our meals for 30 years. And I looked at the telephone on the wall. At 7 a.m, I called Hal Greer. Hal came to the house that Saturday afternoon. We sat at the kitchen table. He listened to everything I told him without interrupting once, which is rarer than most people realize, and which I had come to understand over 40 years as one of his most valuable qualities. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked me one question. "Are you doing this because you are angry, Ruth?" I thought about it honestly. Hal had known me for 40 years and would know the difference. Then I said, "Hal, I just listened to my daughter-in-law plan the disposal of everything Gerald and I built, while my son did not say a word to stop her. I am not angry. Anger would be much simpler than what I am. What I am is done being the last one to know." He looked at me for a moment. Then he opened his notebook and we began. What I agreed to that Saturday afternoon was not a revenge plan. It was the acknowledgement that the family I had spent my life trying to hold together was not something I could hold together any longer by being patient and hoping and not saying the difficult things. That Nathan was further gone than I had allowed myself to believe. That Lily needed someone paying close and consistent attention. That the garden needed something more durable than love alone to protect it. There is a kind of grief in deciding to stop hoping for the thing you have been hoping for. I spent the rest of that weekend with it. On Monday morning, I drove past Whitfield Gardens on the way to the grocery store, as I had done hundreds of times before, the way I had driven past it hundreds of times, and I looked at Gerald's lavender row through the car window. Then I went home and I sat in the garden for a while. Not long. Long enough. Then I got to work. Amber had spent 11 years in residential real estate. She understood title structures, deed transfers, and the shortcuts available to motivated people with the right connections. Whatever Hal and I built had to hold up under that kind of attention. What she had never counted on was that we had 2 years, and were in no hurry at all. We worked the way Gerald worked on anything that mattered, carefully and without rushing, with a clear understanding of what we were protecting and why. The first thing Hal asked about was Amber's professional background. You do not build a structure meant to hold weight without first understanding the weight it has to hold. The land trust came 14 months in. Hal transferred Whitfield Gardens into an irrevocable trust, naming Lily sole beneficiary. On paper, I no longer owned the garden outright. In practice, no one could sell it, develop it, or transfer it without Lily's consent. Gerald's historic urban garden designation, registered 12 years earlier, added city-level protection that even Lily could not waive without a council vote. Gerald had been thinking about this, it turned out, before either of us knew there was anything to think about. The second piece was the document Amber would eventually use against me. Hal drafted a limited power of attorney with language that appeared, on a quick reading, to authorize broad financial management. Read carefully, specifically the fourth section. It authorized only the payment of household utilities and ordinary medical expenses, and nothing further. I had spent 32 years teaching children to read carefully. I knew precisely how to perform not doing so. I had watched enough children pretend not to understand something to know exactly what it looked like from the outside. About 8 months into the work, Nathan came to the house without calling first. I heard his key in the lock, and I was at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of me. I closed it and set my coffee cup on top of it and called out that I would be right there. He stood in the kitchen doorway. He looked at me, then at the table, then at me again. I told him I was writing a note to a former student who was getting married, a girl I had taught in the mid-90s. I kept my voice unhurried and mildly distracted, the way you sound when interrupted in something ordinary. He stood there a beat longer than felt comfortable. Then he sat down, and we talked about the weather for 40 minutes. And when he left, I sat at the table without moving for some time. I had been careless. That evening I called Hal. We agreed to move the notebook to the bottom of a box in Lily's apartment, the one place in Nathan's world that Amber had never thought to arrange. I never did find out what Nathan saw at that kitchen table, whether he believed the story about the wedding note, or whether some part of him understood exactly what his mother was sitting over with her coffee cup placed on top of it. There is a version of that afternoon in which my son looked at the closed notebook and chose, quietly and without telling anyone, not to ask. I will never know if that version is real. I am not sure he knows either. About a year into our work, Hal set his pen down and looked at me across his desk. He said that once the garden went into the trust, there was no version of events in which Nathan did not eventually understand what had been done and why. He was not advising against it. He was making sure I had looked directly at that fact. I told him I had looked at it from every direction I could find. He picked his pen back up. One evening near the end of that first year, I asked him what we would do if they moved faster than we expected. He said, "Then we move with them. Every step they take toward you is a step toward the trap." I thought about that for a long time. The question of Lily had kept me awake for 2 nights. She was 17. I was not entitled to place her in the middle of a legal strategy, regardless of how carefully we had built it. But she was the person in Nathan's household most at risk if things went wrong, and she was old enough to know what she was living inside of. I told her on a Saturday morning over coffee she was too young to be drinking and had been drinking since she was 15, which I had known and chosen not to address. She listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, she said she had known something was wrong since she was 14, that she had watched Amber manage her father the way you manage something that sticks. She said she had not known what to call it, so she had not called it anything. She looked at me and said, "Tell me what to do, Grandma." Hal met her the following Saturday. He told her that real trust was not the same as being careful, and that when the time came, she would need to act on what she knew without waiting to be told. Lily said she understood. She was 17 years old, and she said it the way adults say it when they mean it. She was the right person for the hardest part of the plan, which was pretending every time she walked into Nathan's house for the next year and a half that nothing had changed. About a year and a half into our work together, on a Tuesday afternoon in September, a radiologist showed me something on a scan, and the room went very quiet, in the way rooms go quiet when a word has just changed everything. I drove home and sat in the garden for a while, and then I called Hal. We talked for an hour. We adjusted the timeline together where we could, and left the rest to what was already built. The plan did not require me to have more time than I had. It only needed to hold. That first night in Nathan's guest room, lying on a bed I had not chosen, in a room designed to belong to no one, I thought about another night, the last night before my final chemotherapy treatment, the night when everything I had been building for 2 years became, for the first time, completely real to me in a way that plans on paper never quite are. It was late. The hospital floor had settled into its overnight quiet, the particular rhythm of a ward that has shifted into its nighttime version of itself. My hands ached the way they had been aching for 6 weeks, deep and specific, and my hair was entirely gone by then. I had made a kind of peace with that. My phone lit up on the blanket beside me. Lily. I picked it up and she said, "Grandma," and then her voice broke, and that was as far as she got. Not the controlled kind of crying you can talk through, the kind that has been building for a while and finally found a door open. I waited. I had learned over decades of loving people through hard things that the most useful thing you can offer in those first moments is not words, but presence. I held the phone and I waited, and eventually she got words out in the broken, out-of-order way that people tell things when they are still inside them. She had tried to come to the hospital 3 times that week. The first time she drove to the parking structure, found a space on the 3rd level, and sat in her car for 20 minutes reading and rereading a text from Amber that said, I was exhausted and that unscheduled visits disrupted the treatment staff's carefully managed routines. Lily drove home without going inside. Lily had called ahead the second time, the way she had been told to. A text from Amber arrived when she was standing at the front desk. It said, I was resting and had asked not to be disturbed, that I found it confusing when too many people came without warning, and that it would be better for my recovery if Lily came when I was stronger. The 3rd time, she made it all the way to the sidewalk outside the main entrance and stood there in the cold for a long time, long enough that a security guard asked if she was all right. She said she was fine. She went back to her car and cried until she could see well enough to drive. She told me all of it without stopping. She kept circling back to apologize for not pushing through sooner. She said she should have walked up anyway and made them tell her to her face rather than through text messages. I said, "Lily, listen to me." She went quiet. I said, "The garden is still there. It is waiting for us both." None of what she told you was true. After a while, she asked me if I was scared. I told her I was not scared. I told her the work was nearly done and that she was doing exactly what needed to be done, which was being exactly where she was and not letting Amber see that anything had changed. She cried a little more, and then she gathered herself, the way she always did, with the particular quiet determination that had reminded me of Gerald in her, since she was old enough to have a determination at all. She told me she loved me, and we said good night. I set the phone down on the blanket beside me. The room was as quiet as it had been before. Quieter, maybe, in the way rooms get quiet after something real has been said in them. I thought about Amber's 3 text messages, the language she had chosen, too many people coming without warning, confusing to her, better for her recovery. I turned those words over the way you hold something up to the light to see what is really inside it. She had not kept Lily away to protect Lily from the difficulty of watching me go through treatment. That was the version I had been half willing to accept, that she had been clumsy in her concern, that her instinct to manage things had outrun her judgment. But the text messages were too precisely timed, and the language was too specifically chosen. A woman acting out of concern uses the word overwhelmed. A woman acting out of calculation uses the word confusing. She understood that Lily and I, given an hour alone together, would talk, and that what Lily knew and what I knew, combined in the same room, was a variable she could not afford. I looked at the ceiling for a long time without moving, listening to the quiet of the floor and the distant sounds of the hospital going about its nighttime work. There are decisions you make with your mind and decisions you make somewhere deeper, in a place that does not require explanation or justification. The decision I made that night in the hospital was not a plan. Plans I had built carefully over 2 years with Hal and Lily and Gerald's lawyer and Gerald's own foresight. What shifted was something underneath the plan, the reason for it, the thing that made it worth completing, regardless of what treatment had done to my body or what the coming months would require of me. I was not fighting for a garden. I was fighting for the girl who had stood on that sidewalk 3 times in the cold, trying to reach her grandmother. That was the whole of it. Everything else, the trust, the documents, the 2 years of careful and patient work, was in service of that single fact. And in that hospital room, lying in the dark with the phone quiet on the blanket, I knew that it was enough. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 6 weeks, I slept without difficulty. What Amber did not know about Caroline Webb could fill a courtroom. Eventually, it did. During the 6 weeks I was in treatment, I did not know most of what I am about to tell you. I learned it afterward from Carolyn herself on the last afternoon of my final round. I tell it now because it is part of the same story, and because understanding what Amber was doing while I was in that hospital bed is the only way to understand the full shape of what she had planned. Caroline Webb had been 9 years old when she sat in the third row of my fourth grade classroom at Abernethy Elementary. She was a small girl who flinched slightly when called on directly, who had the look of someone who had learned to be permanently braced for the wrong answer. I had seen that look in children many times. It usually meant one of two things: that something at home had taught them to expect punishment for being wrong, or that they had been wrong in front of people enough times that they had decided not to try. With Caroline, it was the second. She was bright, and she knew it, which made it worse. I stayed after school on Wednesdays for 6 months. We worked through reading exercises together. But mostly what I was trying to do was rebuild her confidence in her own observations. I told her that paying attention was a skill before it was anything else, that most of what people called intelligence was just a willingness to notice things that other people had already decided were not worth noticing. She graduated from the Oregon Health and Science University 31 years later and became the oncologist who managed my treatment. She did not tell me this when she introduced herself. I recognized her from her eyes, the same careful attention, pointed outward now, with the steadiness of someone who had been noticing things professionally for a very long time. Amber visited the hospital 4 times during my 6 weeks. She never came with Nathan. She came in the middle of the day, when the ward was at its busiest, when I was most likely to be sedated or resting. She spoke with nurses and the resident oncologist on duty, never with Caroline directly, not at first. What she said each time followed a consistent pattern. She said I had been getting forgetful, that I confused dates and recent conversations, that I had seemed confused about a family event that had happened 2 months prior. She said it with the controlled worry of a devoted daughter-in-law who was not trying to cause trouble, only to make sure the medical team had the full picture. One nurse made a note in the general chart. Another asked Nathan about it when he came for a visit. And Nathan said, carefully, that Amber would know better than he would about those kinds of things. What Amber was building, one conversation at a time, was a clinical record. A record that, accumulated across 6 weeks and documented in a patient's official medical file, could form the basis of a petition to a family court judge. The petition would request a competency assessment. If the assessment supported her account, the court could appoint a guardian with legal authority to manage my affairs, my finances, my property decisions, everything. I would still be alive. I would simply no longer have any legal standing in my own life. The third time Amber came to the ward, she was directed to Caroline's office. She sat across the desk and began, in the same measured voice, to describe a woman who was losing her grasp on recent events, who sometimes seemed uncertain about where she was. She was 4 sentences into it when Caroline set down her pen. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "what exactly is your relationship to my patient?" Amber explained that she was the daughter-in-law, that the family was very concerned. Caroline thanked her for coming in. She did not write what Amber had said in my official chart. Instead, she opened a separate document and wrote down everything. the date and time of each visit, the name of the staff member Amber spoke with, the exact language Amber used in each conversation, as reported to Caroline by the nurses afterward. She cross-referenced these notes with her own clinical observations of me across the same period. My cognition was intact. My memory was functioning normally under the circumstances of treatment. My ability to understand my situation and communicate my wishes was not impaired. She compiled the complete documentation and sent a sealed copy to Hal Greer 3 days before my last scheduled treatment. She had found his name in my emergency contact file. On my final afternoon, after the last infusion had finished and the nurses had completed their checks and the room had grown quiet, Carolyn came in and sat in the chair beside my bed. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands. Then she said, "Mrs. Ruth, I do not know the full shape of what is happening around you, but I know you taught me to pay close attention when something feels wrong. So I have been paying attention." I looked at her. The 9-year-old in the third row with the careful eyes was still entirely visible in the woman beside me. She placed a sealed envelope on the blanket beside my hand. She said, "Give this to your attorney." I already knew what was inside. I had spent 32 years teaching children in this city. Carolyn Webb was one of 800. It had apparently not occurred to Amber to wonder what a woman with 800 former students working and living in Portland might be able to draw on when she finally needed to. I had not wondered about it consciously myself, but some things you plant without knowing exactly what you are planting for or when it will come back to you. I will tell you what happened during those 6 weeks, the way I eventually learned it, which is in the correct sequence, but not in real time. I was in a hospital bed. I was not there for any of it. What I know comes from 3 sources: the bank records and notary logs that Hal subpoenaed 8 months later, the federal investigation file that Marcus Reed opened the following spring, and Lily, who heard considerably more in Nathan's house during those weeks than Amber ever guessed she would. Amber moved quickly, which was not her usual approach. Her usual approach was patience. The speed in those 6 weeks told me something about how long she had been waiting, and how certain she was that this was the window. The first thing she did was take the limited power of attorney to a notary public in the Pearl District, a firm she used regularly through her real estate work. She presented the document and explained, in the calm and practiced language of a real estate professional who had sat across from many notaries, that her mother-in-law had authorized broad management of the family property during a health crisis. The notary reviewed the first page and the signature, which was genuine, and the notarization seal at the bottom, which was also genuine. She did not read the 4th section, and Amber did not offer to. The notary stamped the document and moved on to her next appointment. The second thing was the phone call to a private real estate investment group she had been in contact with for 3 months before I went into treatment. The group specialized in distressed and motivated seller acquisitions, which means they paid cash, moved quickly, asked few questions, and paid below market value to sellers who needed the transaction to be simple. Amber had already agreed on a figure in her preliminary conversations: $1.1 million. Whitfield Gardens appraised at 1.4. She did not negotiate for the difference. She had not been authorized to, and she knew a prolonged negotiation would create a paper trail. The group wired the funds within 72 hours of the agreement. The third thing was the savings account. I had a secondary account at a credit union in Selwood that I had been contributing to for 11 years, putting in small amounts when I could and leaving them alone. The balance was $340,000. Amber knew about this account because she had sat with me at my kitchen table 4 years earlier, the year after Gerald died, and helped me organize my financial paperwork. She had been helpful and thorough, and I had been grateful. The balance from that account was transferred to the joint account she held with Nathan within 48 hours of the garden sale closing. The combined funds went toward the down payment on a resort property in Scottsdale, Arizona. Amber had a listing saved in her phone under the name that told me everything I needed to know about how long this had been a plan. Amber's Dream. She had first saved that listing in 2019, before the plan had any real shape to it, when it was still the kind of private dream that a person keeps to herself, because the gap between wanting something and being able to have it is too painful to show. The resort had 18 rooms, a pool, and a restaurant space. It was not an investment. It was the life she had been building toward since before she had the means to build it. I learned from Lily that Nathan had been in the room when Amber made the call to the investment group. He had been standing by the kitchen window, which Lily knew because she had been in the hallway. He listened to the call, and when it ended, he said, "Are we sure this is what she would have wanted?" Amber looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Nathan, the paperwork is already done. This is what is best for her." He did not say anything else. He stayed at the window for a while longer than necessary, and then he went to go get his jacket. I have thought about that moment many times. It was the last clear moment Nathan had to say a different word. One word would have been enough. He did not say it. That evening, Amber opened her phone and posted a photograph. She and Nathan were at a new restaurant near the waterfront. Nathan smiling the careful smile of a man who has just done something he is not entirely sure about. Amber with a glass of wine and an expression of uncomplicated happiness. The caption said something about new chapters and being grateful and living with intention. 3 miles away, at the Multnomah County Department of Assessment and Taxation, a records administrator named Teresa Nguyen was working late on a filing backlog. She pulled up the new transfer documentation for a property registered as a historic urban garden site and read through it carefully, the way she read everything, and noticed that the authorization chain had a gap. The limited power of attorney on file authorized utility payments and medical expenses. It said so clearly in the 4th section, which someone would have had to read all the way to the bottom of the first page to reach. The limited power of attorney on file did not carry the scope required for a property transaction of this type. It was a technical irregularity. It was exactly the kind of technical irregularity that a busy afternoon and a full filing backlog would normally allow to pass through unchecked. Teresa Nguyen did not overlook it. She flagged the file, which meant the transaction could not be finalized in the county registry without a supervisor review and additional documentation. Then she went home. That same evening, she sent an email to an address she had found in the property's trust registration file. The subject line had 3 words, found the flag. That first night I did not sleep. I lay in the guest room at Nathan's house and listened to the house settle into its late sounds. The refrigerator in the kitchen, the occasional car passing on the street outside. And I thought about everything I have told you and everything that was still to come. I had spent 2 years preparing for the moment Nathan slid that folder across the coffee table. Now that it had happened, I found I was not frightened. I was something closer to still. Around midnight, I reached into the bottom of my overnight bag and took out the blue notebook. It is a small thing, narrow, about the size of a paperback novel, with a soft cover the color of the sea on an overcast day. I bought it at a drugstore on Belmont Street, and I have carried it through 2 purses and 1 overnight bag and 6 weeks of chemotherapy, and I intend to carry it a while longer. The cover is worn at the corners. The pages are full. I am not a lawyer. I am not a businesswoman in the way Amber understands that word. What I am is a teacher. And the thing they do not tell you about teachers, the thing that most people who were not teachers would not guess, is that we document everything. Not dramatically, not with any intention beyond accuracy. We document because a record held in your own memory is a story, while a record written in your own hand on a specific date is a fact. I started the notebook in the 6th year of Nathan and Amber's marriage, about the time the Saturday visits stopped being Lily's to arrange. I did not start it with any plan in mind. I started it the way you start paying attention to a sound in the walls before you know what the sound means. The entries are specific and they are dated. A sampling. The 4th of March, 6 years ago. Amber told Nathan I had called 3 times that week to complain about the arrangements for Easter. I called once, on the 2nd of March, to ask whether the grandchildren were invited. The 8th of November, 5 years ago. Nathan did not come for Thanksgiving. Amber told me afterward that I had asked them to skip that year because I was feeling overwhelmed by hosting. I had asked them to come an hour earlier so we could cook together. The 16th of February, 3 years ago. Nathan called to ask if he could borrow $4,000 for a home repair. I transferred it the same afternoon. It has not been mentioned since. This is the 6th such transfer listed in the notebook. The total across 9 years is $31,000. The entries go on for 62 pages. I have read them so many times that I know them without looking. I did not write them to use as weapons. I wrote them to know that what I felt was real, that I was not imagining the slow and patient rearrangement of my life that was happening around me. But a record held in your own hand, as it turns out, does not care about the reason you wrote it. It only cares about being true. I listened to the voicemail that had come in while I was at dinner. It was Lily. Her voice was steady, which told me she had thought about what she was going to say before she said it. She said she had seen her father's car in the driveway when she drove past the house that afternoon, and she wanted me to know she loved me and that she was ready whenever I needed her. She said it the way you say something that has been true for a long time, without any particular weight or drama, as if she were simply confirming a fact. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment. Then I called her back. She picked up on the second ring. I asked how she was. She said she was fine, which meant she was holding things together, which was what she always said when she was doing exactly that. She asked how I was. I said, "I am ready, baby. That is exactly what I am." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would see me soon, and we said good night. The days that followed had a particular quality. I was a guest in my son's house. Amber was gracious in the way she was always gracious. The coffee was ready in the morning. The bathroom had fresh towels. Nathan was careful and a little distant, the way he was when he was waiting for something to resolve itself without requiring him to decide anything. I was quiet and unhurried, and I ate meals at their table and thanked Amber for the food, and asked Nathan about his work, and said nothing at all about the folder on the coffee table, which had been moved to the small desk in the corner of the living room. On the morning of the third day, Amber set an envelope beside my coffee cup at breakfast. She said, "We are having a few people over Saturday morning, family, and a couple of Nathan's business associates. We would so love it if you felt up to joining us. It would do you good to see some familiar faces after everything you have been through." I picked up the envelope. I said I would be glad to come. Amber smiled. It was a very good smile. I had been watching it for 9 years, and I could read exactly what was behind it, which was relief. She had expected more resistance from the folder. She had expected me to be more difficult. I had been, from her perspective, wonderfully cooperative, and she was starting to believe that everything was going to go smoothly. That was the last mistake she made. Gerald Whitfield was not a complicated man. He did not make things more difficult than they needed to be, and he had no patience for what he called decorative thinking, which was his term for the kind of reasoning that sounds impressive but does not arrive anywhere useful. What Gerald was, in his quiet and unhurried way, was thorough. He finished what he started, and he thought ahead. And in 12 years of being gone, he has not stopped doing either. I did not know about the historic urban garden designation until Hal told me during our second meeting. He pulled a photocopy from a folder and set it on the kitchen table between us, and I sat and looked at it for a long time before I said anything. Gerald had registered Whitfield Gardens with the City of Portland's Historic Landscape and Urban Agriculture Program 12 years ago, 3 years before his diagnosis, and 9 years before he died. He had done it on a Tuesday afternoon with Hal, in an office in the downtown Civic Building, and he had not told me he was doing it. Not because he was keeping a secret, because he knew, as he knew most things, that I would have asked him why, and he would not have had a satisfying answer. And Gerald did not like to begin conversations he could not finish. What Hal told me Gerald had said in that office was this, and Hal said he remembered it clearly because it was not the kind of thing a person says in a city office on a Tuesday afternoon. "I want to make sure nobody can decide what happens to this land except Ruth. Not the city, not the county, and not our children, if it comes to that." The program coordinator apparently found this an unusual statement of intent for a historic designation application. Hal said Gerald told her it was the clearest thing he had ever wanted, and that he would appreciate it if she would move the paperwork along. She had moved the paperwork along. The designation is not a lock, exactly. It is a condition that travels with the land. Any future owner takes it on when they take on the property. It means the land cannot be demolished, cannot be developed for commercial use, and cannot be restructured in ways that alter its fundamental character as a garden and green space. It means that any sale or transfer must disclose this condition explicitly to the buyer before the transaction closes, so the buyer understands what they are purchasing. An undisclosed historic designation in a property sale is, under Oregon law, a material misrepresentation. Amber had worked in Portland residential real estate for 11 years. Checking the designation status of a property is a standard step in due diligence. It takes approximately 10 minutes. Hal and I do not know whether she found the designation and chose not to tell the buyer, or whether she moved quickly enough that she skipped the step entirely. What we know is that the investment group purchased Whitfield Gardens believing they could break ground on a residential development within 18 months. They had architectural drawings. They had a contractor on retainer. They had applied 3 weeks after the sale closed for a demolition permit with the city. The permit was denied. The reason was cited in the rejection letter. Historic Urban Garden Designation, registered in the name of Gerald F. Whitfield, active and in full effect. The investment group's legal counsel sent a certified letter to Amber's real estate license address the following week. The letter used the words fraudulent misrepresentation and breach of fiduciary duty, and requested the return of all transaction funds pending a formal review of the sale. I held the copy of the original designation document in my hands one evening in the guest room at Nathan's house, the week before the brunch. It was 2 pages long, printed on city letterhead with the program seal at the top. Gerald's signature was on the 2nd page, beside the date and the notary's stamp. His handwriting was neat and forward slanting, the way it always was, the way it still was on the birthday cards stacked in the shoebox on the top shelf of my closet at home. He had always pressed slightly too hard with the pen. You could feel the impression of his letters on the back of the page. He had signed his name to a piece of paper 12 years ago in a downtown office on a Tuesday afternoon. And that piece of paper was currently making it impossible for a company that had paid more than $1 million to touch a single inch of his lavender row. I thought about the south fence post he mentioned was leaning the day before he died. He had been walking those rows, looking at what needed tending and what could hold a little longer. He always knew the difference. And he had known 12 years before anyone else in the family had begun to think about it, that the garden was going to need protecting from something he could not quite see yet, but could sense the direction of. The morning of the brunch, my phone rang at 7:45. It was Hal. He said he had heard from Marcus Reed the previous evening. The investment group's attorneys had been attempting to reach Amber at her real estate office and her personal number since Thursday. She had not responded to either. They had also contacted Nathan at his office, asking for a call back. Nathan had not responded. I asked Hal if he thought they knew what was coming today. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think Amber knows something is wrong. I do not think she knows what it looks like yet." I said that was probably about right. He said, "Drive carefully, Ruth." I thanked him and set the phone down and looked at the window. The morning was gray and the light was low, and it was going to be exactly the kind of day Gerald liked, overcast and cool, good for working in the garden. I got dressed. I taught elementary school for 32 years. Amber thought that was the least impressive thing about me. I suspect she pictured finger paint and lunch supervision and a retirement party with a sheet cake. What she did not picture, because it would not have occurred to her to look for it, was 800 children who had grown up and gone somewhere. Marcus Reed had been 8 years old when he sat in the second row of my third-grade classroom and could not read. Not struggling to read, could not decode the words on a page in any reliable way, and had learned in the manner of children who have been failed by enough adults to develop a strategy to hide it. He was funny and quick, and he redirected conversations with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for years. He had made it to third grade without anyone writing down the truth. I wrote it down. Then I stayed after school on Tuesdays for 6 months. We worked through phonics, and then through sentences, and then through paragraphs. And what I remember most from those Tuesdays is the afternoon Marcus read a full page without stopping and looked up at me with the expression I have only seen a handful of times across 32 years of teaching. The expression of someone who has discovered that a door they believed was locked has been open the entire time. He sat very still for a moment. Then he read the page again, all the way through, just to make sure it would still be true the second time. Marcus Reed was now the Assistant United States Attorney for the District of Oregon. He had been working with Hal for 4 months on a case that, when it was filed, would carry charges of elder financial abuse, deed fraud, and wire fraud. Teresa Nguyen had been 9 years old in my class in the autumn of 1998. She had arrived from Vietnam 6 weeks into the school year, speaking almost no English, and she sat in the back corner as if she were trying to occupy as little space as possible. I learned 3 phrases in Vietnamese before her second week, badly pronounced, from a phrase book I found at the library. Good morning. You are doing well. I am glad you are here. I said them every morning when she came through the door. It took 3 weeks before she stopped flinching when I said her name. She now worked as a senior records administrator at the Multnomah County Department of Assessment and Taxation, where she had flagged the Whitfield Gardens transfer documentation and sent 3 words to Hal Greer. Marcus called me the evening before the brunch to confirm that everything was in position. He said the case file was complete and that he and 2 colleagues would be available if they were needed. He said, Mrs. Ruth, we are ready. Just say the word. I thanked him and said good night and set the phone on the nightstand. I sat in the quiet of the guest room for a while. The closed drawer where Gerald's photograph lived, the beige walls that belonged to no one, the blue notebook in my bag on the chair. Everything that needed to be in place was in place. I had spent 2 years building toward tomorrow morning. Tomorrow was going to come regardless of how I felt about it. That's the thing about plans. At 10:15, there was a knock at the door. It was Nathan. He came in and sat in the chair beside the window. And he did not look at me directly for a moment, which told me everything I needed to know about whose idea this visit was. He was wearing the careful expression of a man who has been given a task he is not entirely sure he should be doing. He said he knew I was upset, and he understood, and he was sorry about the way things had happened. He said the folder on the desk was really just a formality, that if I signed it, we could all move forward and things could go back to normal and nobody needed to make this bigger than it needed to be. He said Amber had worked very hard to make sure the transition was handled properly. I looked at my son. He was 43 years old, sitting in that chair with the posture of someone waiting to be excused from a room he had walked into reluctantly. I had watched him become someone I recognized less clearly over 9 years, not from any single change, but from so many small ones, accumulated so patiently. I said, "Nathan, whose idea was it for you to come talk to me tonight?" He did not answer immediately. He looked at his hands. Then he looked up and said he just wanted things to be all right between us, and that he thought they still could be. I told him I loved him. I told him I would see him at breakfast and he should get some sleep. He stood up and nodded and went to the door, and I watched him go. And I sat in the dark after the door closed. I did not feel like someone who had won something. I felt the grief of a woman who has known something for a long time and has just had it confirmed in the saddest way available. Nathan was further gone than I had wanted to admit. The plan accounted for every document and every legal structure and every piece of paper Hal and I had prepared. What it could not account for was what Nathan would do when the truth was in front of him in that room tomorrow, and he had to choose without Amber standing behind him. That has always been the variable I could not build around. I picked up Gerald's Bible from the nightstand and held it for a while without opening it. The house was quiet. The city was quiet. Tomorrow was going to be whatever it was going to be. I put the Bible in my bag for the morning. I woke at 5 in the morning on the day of the brunch, not from anxiety. I woke the way I had been waking since the end of treatment, with a sudden, clean alertness, the body deciding it had slept enough before the mind had a chance to agree. I lay still for a moment and took stock of myself, the way I had been doing every morning since the hospital. Hands steady. Chest clear. The particular ache that had lived in my joints for 6 weeks was quieter than it had been, almost manageable. Not gone, but quieter. I got up and went to the kitchen. I had been a guest in this kitchen for nearly 2 weeks, and I knew exactly where everything was. The coffee at the back of the left cabinet, the filters in the drawer to the right of the sink, the good mugs on the top shelf, because they were for company, not for mornings. I took one of the good mugs. I made the coffee the way I had been making it for 40 years. Strong. Gerald's word for it was honest, which I always thought was the right word. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark with the mug between my hands, and I looked out the window at the city starting to find its light. The sky was still the deep gray of before dawn, just beginning to separate at the edges, where it would eventually become morning. I did not make a list of things I was feeling. I sat with the coffee, and I let the quiet be what it was. Upstairs, I heard voices. Amber's first, clearer than Nathan's, the way her voice was always clearer than his in a room, always more certain of being heard. Then Nathan's, briefer. Then Amber's again, with the specific tone she used when a conversation had already been decided and she was finishing it, not continuing it. I had heard that tone at enough dinner tables to know it without needing the words. I finished my coffee. I set the mug in the sink and went back to the guest room. I took Gerald's Bible from the nightstand and sat on the edge of the bed and opened it to Romans, 12th chapter, 19th verse. He had underlined it in pencil decades ago, the careful pencil he used for things he wanted to be able to revisit, though he never changed his mind about this one. I read it once. I closed the book. There was nothing more to add to it. I had been adding things to it for 67 years, and that morning it seemed complete without my additions. I put the Bible in my bag with the blue notebook and Hal's folder. Then I got dressed. The dress was one I had bought 2 years before my diagnosis. The color of the garden in early July. A blue that carries green in it. The exact color of lavender leaves in the period before the purple flowers come. I had not worn it since the last Sunday I went to church before I went into treatment. I stood in front of the narrow mirror on the back of the guest room door, and I looked at myself in it for a moment. She looked like herself, a 67-year-old woman in a blue-green dress with short gray hair growing back in the particular way it grows back after chemotherapy, which tends to come back softer than it was before. Not a warrior, not a symbol, just the woman who had done the work and come to the morning of it. I decided that was exactly right. Lily's car was outside at 7:30. I let myself out the front door. She was sitting in the driver's seat, and she looked up when I opened the door, and she looked at my face and at my bag, and she gave me the small nod she had been giving things since she was old enough to understand what she was looking at. We did not talk much in the first part of the drive. Lily took us the long way around, the way that goes past the river. The morning was gray and cool, and the city was still in its early Saturday mode, unhurried, not yet fully committed to being a day. At the light on Burnside, she reached across and put her hand over mine on the armrest. I turned my hand palm up and held hers. We stayed like that until the light changed. When we were 2 blocks from the house, she said, "Grandma, are you sure about this?" I looked at her profile in the morning light. 20 years old. 2 years of knowing what she knew and saying nothing and showing up at her father's house for Sunday dinner and acting exactly like the granddaughter she was. Nobody had asked that of her. She had simply understood what was needed, and she had done it. I said, "Baby, I have never been more sure of anything since the day I married your grandfather." She nodded and turned onto Nathan's Street. Through the windshield, I could see the front door was open, and the first guests were arriving. Through the large window, the room was arranged with Amber's precise eye. White linens and flowers, and the careful staging of a family who has always had plenty. Amber was near the window in a white dress, speaking to someone, her face in the composed and gracious register she wore when she was performing for an audience she had selected. I looked at the house. I thought about Gerald's lavender row and the orange survey stakes and the 14 months Lily had been carrying the name of her grandmother's garden in a legal document, and the doctor who had kept the right kind of notes, and the woman who had flagged the right kind of file, and the man who had learned to read on a Tuesday afternoon and gone somewhere with it. I thought about all of that. Then I let it go. Lily put her hand briefly on my arm. 1 second. She did not say anything. I picked up my bag and I got out of the car. The moment I walked through that door, I understood something about Amber I had not seen clearly before. She had invited me to this brunch because she believed I was the decoration. The older woman recovering from cancer, quietly cooperative, finally persuaded to be practical. My presence made the occasion look like a family gathering instead of what it was. I was the evidence of goodwill, and she needed me in the room. I walked in. The living room had been transformed, the furniture arranged to maximize the sense of a successful occasion, round tables with white linens and small flower arrangements, the careful aesthetic effort that suggests money without saying it directly. Perhaps 20 people, already present with mimosas and small plates, the comfortable warmth of a gathering in its early stages. 3 people I had known for years and had not seen since Gerald's funeral were standing near the window. The smell of fresh pastries from the catering station, morning light through the tall windows, good light, the kind Amber would have considered when she chose the time. Amber came toward me with the hostess welcome and kissed me on the cheek. "Mom, you look wonderful," she said. "We are so glad you could be here today." Several people smiled, and one of Nathan's business associates raised his glass in a small greeting. I smiled at the room and said I was glad to be there. I looked for Nathan. He was standing near the tall bookcase he had built with Gerald the summer he was 17, holding a glass of orange juice, watching the room with the expression of a man who has agreed to something and is now standing at the edge of it, waiting to find out what it will require. He saw me and gave the small nod of a man who has decided that acknowledging a thing and addressing it are different actions. I nodded back. I found a chair at one of the round tables toward the back of the room, a chair with a clear sight line to both Amber and Nathan and the door, and I sat down. I took the Bible out of my bag and set it on the table to the left of my water glass. Nothing dramatic, just where I needed it to be, visible to anyone who looked at the table. Lily sat in the chair beside me. She put her napkin in her lap and looked at the centerpiece flowers and did not look at me, which was exactly right. Amber moved to the center of the room with the effortless authority of someone who has been rehearsing this moment. She thanked everyone for coming on such a beautiful autumn morning. She said she and Nathan had an exciting announcement to share, something they had been working toward for a while. She described the Scottsdale property, the 18 rooms, the restaurant space, the pool, the vision for a boutique resort experience. She had photographs on a tablet that were passed around the room. The photographs were beautiful. The property was beautiful. She had excellent taste, and she had spent real money on this dream. And neither of those things was untrue. She talked about Nathan's partnership and his courage in making this leap. She thanked the business associates who had already expressed interest. She said she also wanted to acknowledge the trust that Ruth had placed in the family during her recovery. Then she said something specific. She said that when they had spoken about the family's future last spring, Ruth had made clear that she wanted the next generation to build on solid ground, and that she and Nathan had done everything possible to honor that conversation. I listened to her say this. I held my expression exactly where it had been. There was no conversation last spring. There had been no discussion of the family's future, no blessing given, no direction offered. She had just said, in front of 20 people, the precise lie I needed her to say. Lily's hand found mine under the table for just 1 second, and then went back to her lap. She spoke for perhaps 8 minutes, and she was very good at it. I will say this more than once because it is true, and because truth is the only standard that matters in a room like that one. I watched the room respond to her the way rooms respond to someone who knows what she is doing. A woman to my left, a friend of Amber's I had been introduced to twice without retaining her name, leaned toward me with a warm smile. "Mrs. Whitfield, you must be so proud of your son." I said, "I am very much looking forward to seeing how this morning unfolds." And I meant every word of it. She took this as enthusiasm. She smiled and turned back to Amber. Amber finished her remarks with the thing I had known was coming. She looked around the room and said that none of this would have been possible without the generosity and love of the people in this room. and particularly without the support of their family. As she said those last words, she looked at me. She held my gaze for 2 full seconds with an expression of warm and uncomplicated gratitude. I held her gaze. The room applauded. Nathan brought his hands together from his position near the bookcase with the careful, measured applause of a man performing an action he has decided is required of him. I waited for the applause to settle. Then I put both hands on the table, and I stood up. The room quieted in the way rooms quiet when someone does something unexpected in a space where the social choreography has been established. Amber's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The faintest adjustment around the eyes. I said, "Thank you, Amber. I have a few things I would like to share with everyone as well, if you do not mind." Amber did not move. I reached into my bag. I took 3 folders from my bag and set them on the table. The room went quiet in a different way than it had when I stood up. The first quiet was social surprise. This quiet was something else. Amber recovered in approximately 2 seconds, which I noted with a kind of professional respect. 2 seconds is fast. She moved toward the table with the calm efficiency of someone who has planned for a disruption and would like to manage it quickly and quietly. "Mom," she said, "I think maybe this isn't the right moment for this." She did not finish the sentence. Hal was already at the door. My phone was in my left hand under the table. I had typed 1 word before I stood, and I pressed "Send now." 40 seconds later, the front door opened, and Hal Greer walked into the room. He was 70 years old, and he had the unhurried walk of a man who owns every room he enters, because he has been in too many rooms to be impressed by any of them. He was wearing his dark suit, the one he wore to things that mattered, and he carried his leather portfolio under his arm. He did not look at Amber. He looked at me, and I gave him a small nod, and he walked to the table and stood beside me. The room was very still. I could hear Amber adjusting her approach, the way you can sometimes hear a person think when the room is quiet enough. She turned to the guests nearest her with a composed smile. She said, "I have complete legal authorization for everything that has been done. The paperwork is all properly executed and in order." Hal opened his portfolio. He took out 2 documents and laid them side by side on the table. The first was the limited power of attorney that Amber had used at the notary's office 6 weeks ago. The second was a clean copy of the same document with Section 4 highlighted in yellow. Hal said, "This is the document Mrs. Amber Whitfield presented as authorization for the sale of the property at Whitfield Gardens and the liquidation of the associated savings account." He spoke in the particular flat register of a man who has delivered unwelcome information in front of audiences before and understands that the absence of drama is more effective than its presence. I would direct everyone's attention to the highlighted section. He read it aloud. "This instrument grants limited authority for the purposes of payment of ordinary household utility expenses and medical expenses incurred during a period of health-related incapacity. This instrument does not and shall not confer authority to enter into, execute, or authorize any transaction pertaining to real property, investment accounts, or any asset valued in excess of $5,000. He set the document down. The room processed this in the silence that follows a precise and undramatic statement. I watched it process. I watched one of Nathan's business associates look at his colleague with the specific expression of a man recalculating his position. I watched a woman Amber had introduced as her closest friend look down at her mimosa glass and then back up with an expression she was working to keep neutral. Amber's posture had not changed. She was still standing with the composed authority of a woman who has prepared for this possibility. I gave her credit for that. She said the document had been interpreted correctly at the time of signing by all parties involved, and that she was happy to have her own legal counsel review it at a more appropriate time. Hal opened the portfolio again. He took out a second set of documents. These were printed on heavy paper with the Oregon Health and Science University letterhead at the top. He set them on the table with the particular care of a man placing something that does not need commentary. He said, "These are the supplementary observation records maintained by the attending oncologist during Mrs. Ruth Whitfield's 6-week treatment period." He read from the cover page. 4 visits to the oncology ward by a woman identifying herself as the patient's daughter-in-law. The dates of those visits. The specific language used with nursing staff on each occasion. He paused and then read, "Patient gets confused about recent events. Patient sometimes fails to recognize family members. Patient may benefit from a cognitive capacity assessment." He looked up. The attending physician's own clinical record of the patient during this same 6-week period notes no cognitive impairment of any kind. The attending physician is available to testify to that effect. Amber's phone vibrated on the table beside her. She glanced at the screen, and something moved across her face very quickly, a tightening around the eyes that was there and gone before most people in the room could have caught it. The kind of thing you see only if you have been watching someone for a long time and you know what their face looks like when the room is not watching it back. She did not pick it up. The business associate to Nathan's left set his glass down on the table. He said, in a careful and uninflected voice, "I think I need to step out and make a phone call to my attorney." Nathan had not moved from his position near the bookcase. He was looking at Amber, not at me, not at Hal, not at the documents on the table. He was looking at his wife with the fixed attention of a man who is seeing something for the first time that has been in front of him for a long time and could not be unseen. No expression, no management, no careful performance of a man who has decided what he thinks. Just a man looking at a woman and trying to understand what he was seeing. I watched him for a moment. Then I reached into my bag again. The document I took from my bag was 2 pages long, printed on City of Portland letterhead. I set it beside the power of attorney and the oncology records and smoothed it flat. Hal picked it up. "This is the Historic Urban Garden Site designation for the property registered as Whitfield Gardens," he said. "It was filed with the City of Portland Landscape and Urban Agriculture Program 12 years ago. The application was submitted by Gerald F. Whitfield and approved by the program office the same month. The designation is active and in full effect." He set it down so the room could see Gerald's signature at the bottom of the second page. "Under the terms of this designation," Hal continued, "the property cannot be demolished, cannot be developed, and cannot be repurposed in any way that alters its character as a garden. Any sale of the property requires explicit disclosure of the designation to the buyer before closing." He turned to look at Amber. The investment group that purchased Whitfield Gardens was not informed of the designation. They applied for a demolition permit with the city 3 weeks after closing. The permit was denied. Their legal team has determined that the failure to disclose constitutes fraudulent misrepresentation under Oregon state law. As of this morning, they are preparing to file suit. The room was very quiet. Amber said, "That designation can be overturned. There are processes for this, a petition to the city, a review period. This is not as final as it sounds." Hal looked at her with the expression of a man who has been practicing law long enough to have heard every version of this sentence. He said, "It requires a unanimous city council vote to remove a historic designation of this classification. The petition process takes a minimum of 14 months. You have 11 days before the investment group's attorneys file suit against you personally." He paused. 14 months is not a useful timeline for your situation. More than one person had gone very still. The man who had stepped out to call his attorney was back in the doorway with his phone in his hand and an expression he was not managing. I watched the people who had come believing they were attending a business brunch recalibrate what they were actually attending. The woman who had asked if I was proud of my son looked at the table and then away. A man near the window took a small step backward, the involuntary movement of someone who has understood that the thing they stepped toward is not what it appeared to be. Nathan had not moved from his position near the bookcase. He was still holding the orange juice glass. He had not drunk from it for some time. He said, "Amber," just her name, nothing after it. She looked at him. He said, "Did you know about this when you arranged the sale?" The room heard the question and understood it. I understood what it cost him to ask it in front of people whose professional respect he had spent years cultivating. Amber said, "Nathan, this is not the moment for this conversation. We need to have our attorneys present before we discuss any of this further." Nathan looked at the documents on the table. Then he looked back at her, and something shifted in his face, a second understanding arriving behind the first. He said, "You told me the garden sold for $980,000. That was the number on the paper I signed. That was the number we put toward Scottsdale." He paused. "Hal just said the buyer paid $1.1 million. The room was very quiet. "Where is the rest of it?" Amber. She did not answer that one either. But the silence after it was different from the silence after the first question. The first question had been about the garden. This one was about the two of them, and everyone in the room understood the difference. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. He did not say anything else. He looked down at the glass in his hand, as if he were seeing it for the first time and trying to remember why he was holding it. Hal opened the portfolio one more time. The next document was the trust instrument, the one I had signed in Hal's office 14 months before anyone sold anything, naming Lily as sole beneficiary of Whitfield Gardens. Hal said, "Whitfield Gardens was transferred into an irrevocable land trust 14 months before the attempted sale. It has not been legally transferable by Mrs. Ruth Whitfield since. Any transaction conveying it requires the written consent of the named trustee. That consent was neither sought nor given." He paused. "In plain terms, the garden was never theirs to sell. The buyer never validly purchased it. In law, the transaction does not exist. The term for this is nullity." Lily was sitting next to me, very still, her hands folded in her lap, not performing anything, just being entirely present in the way that people who know what they are doing are present. She was 20 years old. She had been the named trustee of a piece of land for 14 months and had sat in Nathan's house for dinner and said nothing. And she was holding all of it with a steadiness that made me think of the garden in the early morning before the light was fully up. Nathan walked slowly from the bookcase to the nearest chair and sat down. He set the orange juice glass on the table carefully, as if setting it down required attention. He did not look at Amber or at me. He looked at the historic designation document, at his father's signature at the bottom of the second page. He put his hand flat on the paper, over his father's name. He held it there for a moment. Not long, just long enough. Then he lifted it. He sat with whatever he was working through in the particular silence of a man who has understood something he cannot take back to before he understood it. I watched him for a moment. Then I reached into my bag for the third time, and I took out the blue notebook. I opened the blue notebook, and I began to read. The entries were specific. They were dated. I read them in the order I had written them, which was the order they had happened, which was the only order that mattered. I read the entry from the 4th of March, 6 years ago. Amber had told Nathan I called 3 times that week to complain about the Easter arrangements. I had called once to ask whether the grandchildren were invited. I read the entry from the 8th of November, 5 years ago. Nathan did not come for Thanksgiving. Amber told me afterward that I had asked them not to attend because I was overwhelmed by hosting. I had asked them to come an hour early so we could cook together. Amber said, "Mom, I really think we should take this discussion somewhere private." I turned the page and kept reading. I read the entry from the 16th of February, 3 years ago. Nathan called to borrow $4,000 for a home repair. I transferred it the same afternoon. It had not been mentioned since. This was the 6th such transfer in the notebook. I read the total, $31,000 across 9 years. Amber said, "These are private family matters. This is not appropriate for this setting." The room was very still. I was aware of it peripherally, the way you were aware of a room when you were reading in it, its presence without its detail. I kept my voice at the same level and the same pace it had been, not louder, not softer, the same. I read 4 more entries. I did not read all 62 pages. I read enough. Somewhere in the 4th entry, without looking at Amber, without appearing to decide anything, Nathan moved his chair just a few inches, a slow, quiet, lateral shift to the left, the way you shift your weight after standing too long in one position. He did not look at his wife. He did not look at me. Then he sat still again. One of his business associates noticed. She looked at Nathan and then looked away. Amber said, "You have been keeping records on us. You have been writing down everything we did for years and sitting in our house and keeping records." She stopped. She seemed to realize, a beat too late, that finishing the sentence was not going to help her. I looked up from the notebook. "Yes," I said. "I was paying attention. I always was." The room heard this. The room understood something about those 2 sentences that I would not have been able to explain in 100 words. Something that lived in the gap between them, between what she had said and what I had said back. Amber did not speak again immediately. Hal opened the portfolio. He took out 3 sheets of paper and placed them on the table side by side. Each one held a name, a professional title, and a date. The date on each was the year the person had graduated from Abernethy Elementary School in southeast Portland. He said, "During the 6 weeks of Mrs. Ruth Whitfield's treatment, 3 individuals with professional access chose to act on what they knew." He touched the first sheet. Dr. Carolyn Webb, attending oncologist, who documented every unauthorized approach to the ward regarding her patient's cognitive status and forwarded the record to legal counsel. He touched the second. Teresa Nguyen, senior records administrator at Multnomah County, who flagged the irregularity in the Whitfield Gardens transfer before it could be finalized. He touched the third. And Marcus Reed, Assistant United States Attorney for the District of Oregon, who has built the federal case over the past 4 months. He looked at the room. Amber spoke before he could continue. Her voice had found a harder edge now, the edge of someone reaching for the one explanation that would put her back on solid ground. She said, "So you hired 3 professionals to come after me, a doctor, a records clerk, and a prosecutor. That is what this is." I looked at her. "I did not hire anyone. Amber," I said. "I taught them." Hal let that settle for a moment. Then he said the rest of it. All 3 were students of Mrs. Ruth Whitfield at Abernethy Elementary School. The room went quiet in a way that was different from the other quiets of that morning. This one had weight to it, the weight of something landing after a long time in the air. A woman near the window pressed her hand to her mouth. Behind me, a man set his glass down without any awareness of doing it. Nobody spoke. And then the front door opened. Marcus Reed walked in. He was not in a uniform. He was in a dark charcoal suit, carrying a leather portfolio with the unhurried authority of a man who has been in enough rooms not to be impressed by any of them. He looked at me briefly with an expression I recognized from a Tuesday afternoon 30 years ago, when a boy had read a page and looked up to make sure it was still true. Then he looked at Amber. He said, "The federal case file is complete. I want you to understand that before we proceed." Amber was standing in the center of the room in her white dress, her husband in a chair 3 feet from where he had been an hour ago, her phone on the table with 3 unanswered calls from the investment group's attorneys. She looked around the room for someone to look back at her. There was not one. Nathan was looking at the floor. Her friends were looking at their glasses. The business associates were looking at Hal and Marcus and the documents. No one in that room was looking at Amber Whitfield with anything she could use. I watched her understand this. It took about 4 seconds. It was not triumphant to watch. It was simply what was true. I closed the blue notebook and set it on the table. Hal reached into his portfolio one final time. He took out something I had not seen since the afternoon Gerald dictated it to him 3 days before my husband died. A letter does not need to be legal to be true. Gerald knew that. He knew it the way he knew most things, not through reasoning it out, but through having lived long enough to understand the difference between things that have authority and things that simply are. Hal reached into the portfolio and took out an envelope. It was not new. The paper had the particular warm yellow of things that have been kept carefully for a long time. And the handwriting on the front was Gerald's, the pressed, too hard forward slant I knew from 40 years of grocery lists and birthday cards and the occasional note left on the kitchen counter when he was out early. He had written my name on the front and nothing else. Hal held it for a moment before he opened it. He said, "Gerald dictated this to me on the 16th of October, 3 days before he died. He asked that I keep it sealed and give it to you when the time was right. He did not specify what the right time would look like. I believe he trusted that I would know it when I saw it." The room was very quiet. Hal unfolded the pages and he read, "Ruth, I have been trying to figure out what to say for longer than I have been able to write it down. You know I am not a letter writer. You have been correcting my punctuation for 40 years, and I have never once taken the advice. So you will have to forgive what comes next. I want to tell you something about Amber. I know you have been managing a feeling about her for a long time, and I know you have not said it because you are trying to be fair, and because you love Nathan, and because you are, in this as in most things, more patient than the situation deserves. I need you to know that you are not wrong about what you feel. I have been watching her manage Nathan the way you manage a door that sticks. Just enough pressure in just the right place, consistently, over time. She does it so naturally that I am not sure she always knows she is doing it. But Ruth, in the moments when it matters, when the choice is real, she knows." Lily put her hand flat on the table beside me, not reaching for mine, just placing it there, palm down, steady. I did not look at her. We kept listening. "I do not know what is going to happen. I am not going to be here to see it, and that is the hardest thing I have had to write in a long time. But I know you, and I want you to know that whatever you decide to do, and however long it takes, I am not the least bit concerned about the outcome. You have been the strongest person in every room you have ever walked into. You just never needed anyone to notice. I noticed. I always noticed. Take care of Lily. Take care of the garden. Everything else will take care of itself." Hal lowered the pages. He said, he started to write one more sentence after that, and then crossed it out completely. I cannot read what it was. He pressed hard enough into the paper that you can feel the impression of it, but the ink is entirely covered. I have always believed that was its own kind of message. In the second row of the room, in the chair where she had sat since the beginning of the brunch, the woman who had asked me if I was proud of my son set her glass down carefully on the nearest table. She picked up her purse. She looked at no one and walked to the door. Others followed in the way people leave a space that has become too private. Amber had already gone. When Hal read the words, "I noticed, I always noticed," she stood and walked out of the room. Her heels made a sound on the floor that moved down the hallway and then stopped. Nobody called after her. Nobody moved. The letter continued, and we listened. Nathan had his face in his hands. His shoulders were moving. 43 years old and crying the way he had not cried in front of me since his father's funeral, when he had stood in the kitchen before we left, and I had put my hand on his back. He was not making a sound, just the shoulders. Lily was crying too, quietly, with the particular directness she had always had, tears on her face and hands still in her lap, and no performance about it. I did not go to Nathan yet. I sat in my chair and I let the room be what it was. The catering staff had withdrawn to the kitchen. Marcus was near the far wall, giving the family whatever space it needed. Hal folded the letter and placed it on the table in front of me. Nathan looked at it. He extended one hand slowly toward the envelope, toward his father's handwriting. Then he stopped. He held it there for a moment, a few inches above the paper. Then he drew it back and set it in his lap. I put my hand on the envelope. Gerald's handwriting on the front. My name, pressed into the paper a little harder than it needed to be. I picked it up and I put it in my bag. Then I looked at Nathan. He looked up. He still had his hand over his mouth, the way he did when he was holding himself together. His eyes were red. His hair was out of place, in the way it got when he had been running his hands through it. We looked at each other. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. There was nothing to say that would be equal to it, only what was true. We were still a mother and a son. The distance between us had been built slowly and patiently by someone who was no longer in the room. The distance was still there. We were still here. And it was morning. It was a Tuesday when Lily and I went back to the garden. It has always been Tuesdays for me. The weeks between the brunch and that morning had their own suspended quality, a kind of held breath while the legal pieces moved where they were going to move. Marcus filed the federal charges. The Scottsdale transaction was frozen. The investment group's attorneys settled with a speed that told me they had understood the situation before anyone filed anything. I did not follow the details closely. Hal was there for the details. I was there for what came after them. Nathan came to my house on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the brunch. He came alone. He drove himself in his own car, and he knocked at the door of the Craftsman house, my house, the house he had grown up in. And I let him in and made coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table. He did not have a prepared speech. I knew he would not, because Nathan has never in his life known what to say when what needs to be said is large. He looked around the kitchen the way you look at things you grew up with and have not seen in a while. Then he said, "I remember when Dad and I built that bookcase, the summer I was 17. He kept telling me the level was off, and I kept telling him it was fine." I said, "It was fine." He said, "It was slightly off, and you know it." And then he looked at me, and he was not performing being okay, or performing being sorry, or performing anything at all, which was the first time I had seen that from him in 9 years. And I understood that this was what I had been waiting for, without knowing I had been waiting for it. I did not tell him everything was fine. It was not fine. It would take time to become something, and what it became would not be what it had been before. And that was simply what was true. I told him that his father had loved him and that I loved him, and that neither of those things had ever been in question. I told him that what he did with that was up to him. He stayed for about an hour. We talked about ordinary things, the way people do when the extraordinary has been used up for the day. When he left, he paused in the doorway and turned back. He said, "I'm sorry, Mom." Not an explanation, not a defense, just the 2 words. I said, "I know." He went to his car. I watched him go from the front door the way I had watched him go 1,000 times over the course of his life, when he was small, and then when he was larger, And then when he had stopped coming as often, I closed the door. I stood in the entry with my hand on the doorknob and thought about how long that conversation had been waiting and how much shorter it was than I had expected, and how that was probably right. 3 days later, on a Tuesday, Lily came to the house at 9 in the morning with her garden gloves in her bag and a small lavender cutting she had taken from a neighbor's yard with permission. She said she thought it was time. She was right. The drive to Whitfield Gardens took 11 minutes. When we turned onto the street and I could see the property ahead, the first thing I noticed was that the sign was gone. The white real estate sign with the red letters, the stake holes it had left in the ground at the entrance was still there, small wounds in the soil that the rain would eventually close. We parked and got out and walked in. The garden was overgrown in the particular way of things that have been left alone for a season, not ruined, but untended, with a wildness around the edges that would need attention and a persistence at the center that required none. The lavender row was still there. The roses were still there, late in the season, past their best, but holding. The peony beds along the south fence were dormant, pulled back into themselves, waiting. The orange survey stakes were gone. I noticed their absence, the way you notice the absence of something that had been wrong. We walked the rows without speaking. There is a quality to walking a garden you have not walked for some time that is its own kind of conversation. Your feet relearning the ground, your hands reaching without deciding to, toward the things that need attention. I had been walking this ground for 40 years. My feet remembered it the way hands remember handwriting. We found a patch along the north row where the lavender had thinned and was coming up sparse. Lily knelt beside it first. I knelt beside her. She pressed the cutting into the soil with the careful attention she brought to things that mattered, working it in gently, tamping the earth around it with her fingers. She had learned this the way she had learned most things about the garden, by watching, by being here on Saturday mornings before Saturday mornings were reorganized. I put my hands in the soil beside hers. The ground was cold and damp from the morning. I could feel the specific weight and texture of it, the way it gives under your hands and holds the impression of your fingers for a moment before settling back into itself. Gerald had worked this same soil for 30 years. His hands had known it before mine had. And then we had known it together. And now I was here with his granddaughter, and my hands were in it again. We stayed there for a long time, working in a silence that did not need to be filled. The city made its sounds around the fence. The sky above us was the particular gray of Portland in early April, not resolved, still deciding, the kind of sky that could go either way. I kept my hands in the earth, and I stayed.